So we're going to be, I guess, exploring some of the themes that we've been talking about this morning, but from a radically different set of perspectives. We have with us Theo Padnos, who's an author and journalist, a PhD in comparative literature, I believe, and who was taken captive while working as a journalist in Syria in 2012 and held for almost 2 years by the Nusra Front. His mother, Nancy Curtis, and cousin, Amy Rosen, who worked eventually with a coalition of people throughout that period to get him out. And then Larry Wright, correspondent for The New Yorker, a staff writer for The New Yorker, who wrote a very powerful piece called 5 Hostages for The New Yorker earlier this year that told the story of Theo's captivity and that of the 4 other hostages and their respective fates. And what I'm hoping we can do is explore the story of what happened to Theo and how you managed in the end to get him out. And also, Theo, you have now had probably more direct experience at incredible cost of this movement that is at war with the United States than any other American, and we're hoping to get to some of the insights that you learned. And Nancy, I wondered if we could start with you and the moment when you first realized that something had gone wrong. You knew Theo was in Turkey and you were in touch with him.
Yes.
Right?
I knew he wanted to get into Syria for just a couple of days because he really wanted to talk to the people and find out what the sense is. Why are you doing this? What's going on? I was worried about it, but I also knew that he was so familiar with the culture and fluent in the language, I didn't let myself worry. Meantime, he was in the process of buying us a wood stove for our house in Vermont. So every day we had this little email conversation, do we want the Defiant or do we want the whatever, and what color do we want? And all of a sudden, I didn't hear from him. And I sent him, "Hi, Pop, haven't heard from you, what's going on?" Didn't want to sound like a worried mother, but I didn't get an answer, and I knew that was it. That something terrible had happened, and I knew there had been bombing, shelling, conflict, and I didn't know anything, and I started calling my cousin Amy and a friend who worked in a congressman's office. I didn't know where to begin, but that's how it started.
And so, Theo, what had happened?
I mean, what had happened was that I had made friends with 3 young men in Antakya, Turkey, on the border with Syria, just north of Aleppo. I had believed these people to be fixers with the Free Syrian Army, and I got in a car with these people like an idiot, and I drove to the border, and then I ran across the border with them. We were met by another car, and off we went to Bennet. And the first night I slept in an abandoned house with them. We seemed to be friends. The next morning, we did an interview. I was interviewing them. They recorded it on video. After about 15 minutes, I ran out of questions, and I turned to them. There was 3 of them sitting in front of me like this. I said, "Okay, Shabab, I'm done with my questions." And they stood up and came at me. Boom. Handcuffs, and they tied up my legs, and they said, we're from the Al-Qaeda organization. Didn't you know? And that's how it began for me.
What was going through your mind?
I said, shit. I tried to, I had a friendly relationship with these people, so I figured I could continue, what I had read, I knew something about kidnappings in this kind of environment. I was aware that the one thing you don't want to have happen is to have them pass you along to another group. So I tried to stay with them, and in fact, I escaped from these people. And I went to the Free Syrian Army, and then I was tried in an Islamic court. And the Islamic judge asked me a few questions and gave me back to my kidnappers, and they brought me to...
These are the moderates that we're working with in Syria.
These are nice Syrian people.
And they
I didn't
returned you
ask
to
them
your
about their,
captors.
sorry?
Yeah, and they returned you to your captors.
They returned me to my captors, yeah. I had a trial in the Islamic court, so the judge determined that that I deserved to go back to my captors. I belong to them.
Well, Amy, can you then pick up the thread where Nancy left it and tell us what was going on the outside during this period, and when did you first get any sense who was holding Theo and that he was in fact even still alive?
Yeah, well, as Nancy said, she reached out to me and another cousin who's a former journalist and another cousin who's a current journalist. And we just all started calling everybody we could possibly. At the time, Austin Tice had already been taken and working with the Washington Post, but Theo, was a freelancer, so there wasn't a firm or a newspaper or anybody there to help us. And working the government, and literally started by trying to find where he'd been in Turkey, where he'd been staying, with the clues that we had. He had changed his name legally, so to protect himself, but that further complicated it. Long calls with Facebook and other organizations trying to get into his mail and just see what was happening. But meanwhile, we were, incredibly fortunate as a family because we knew a lot of people, and we knew a little bit about how the world worked, and we just kept pounding and talking to everybody. And shortly thereafter, I literally was at a New York Ideas dinner sitting next to David Bradley, who mentioned that he was helping involved with Jim Foley's family. And I said, oh, isn't that interesting? We have a missing cousin. He said, oh, would you come to Washington tomorrow? Which I did. And it started with, David and his incredible team of people who helped us order what our search was. But, the truth was that these three cousins, including myself, didn't really discuss with Nancy. We had no confidence that Theo was alive. And what we wanted to make sure is that if he was dead, that we did everything we could, for really Nancy's sake at that point, to find out what had happened. And it took 9 months until we had proof of life. And it took 9 months, at which point an American he'd been being held with, Matt Schreier, escaped, and at which point the State Department, who had not provided much of any information for us at that point, told us that they had proof of life.
Theo, you wrote a very powerful piece for the New York Times Magazine about your captivity, and you describe a period after Matt left when you were tortured, viciously by your captors, but you also describe pretty continuous torture from the moment you were taken. And it really wasn't even clear to me, reading the piece, what outcome the hostage takers were after, why they continued to beat you and use a cattle prod on you. They didn't seem particularly interested in having you convert. So what was the point?
They are interested in having all unbelievers or all Christians, anybody who is not Muslim, they want them all to convert, but not through means of torture. You're supposed to accept it on your own. You read the Quran and come to your own reasoned decision.
And actually, I should have said at the outset, you had lived in Yemen for 2 years and written a book about Islam before this, and were fluent in Arabic.
Right, and so I know how it is that you're meant to approach the religion of Islam and how they are meant to introduce you to the doctrines. I mean, in my view, first of all, for months and months and months, they were just beating me. And I would come back to my cell afterwards, and I would think, what the hell? What was that about? Because, they would go through the motions of asking me questions. They would pretend that this is an interrogation, but I knew that they weren't taking notes. And I could answer anything. One time they go, are you from the Pentagon or are you from the CIA? And I go, what's the difference? And they go, good point. They were not after specific specific information. Anyway, my feeling is that the function of the torture is for them. It's an initiation ceremony that deepens the commitment of especially the children. Always the children were involved, and it's frightening for the children to participate in this, and it alters the psychology of the children. Listen, the entire environment is frightening, particularly when they're bombing. And that bombing alters the psychology of the children. Then they bring them down into the basement. They supply the kids with the torture instruments, and they say, have at them. And the kids are like, I don't really want to. But they do eventually. And that alters them. Over time, it alters them. And, in my view, all the outsiders, the midway Muslims, the people who aren't totally committed, they get committed through the violence. And so the more violence that exists in this culture, the worse it is for us, I think.
Larry, we have a photo of the 4 other hostages that were taken. I think we can project it up there. I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about each of them, who they were, and how their experience, to the extent we know what it was, differed or was similar to what Theo went through.
The main difference is that they had the misfortune of being taken by ISIS, or falling into the hands of ISIS. Jim Foley was a reporter. He'd actually been captured previously in Libya, and thanks to David Bradley, who is really the hero of this story, he was freed from that incarceration, and then went back into conflict journalism and was taken by ISIS, as was another reporter, Stephen Sotloff. And then there were 2 aid workers, Peter Kassig, who very entrepreneurial. He started his own little aid service to get, medical care to places where it was really most needed, places that UN workers and so on wouldn't go to. He personally went and trained people in emergency care and took care of people. And then Caleb Mueller was, a very extraordinary person. Had, been assisting people, all over the world, but especially, in Syria, she had taken on this task of going to probably the worst place in the world to try to help people out. And she was, I think, on a path to some kind of sainthood. These are the kind of people that, when you have conflict, you need information and you need help. Often they're criticized for going to help out. But where else do you get the information, and who else is going to help? Is young people, idealistic young people like that, who are the people that go and try to participate and help out.
And the 4 other hostages all were killed.
Yeah.
You said the difference that was that they were held by ISIS and Theo by the Nusra Front. Can you just split those 2 groups apart for us, if you would, and then how was it that Theo was freed in the end?
Well, as Theo would tell you, it's not so easy to split these groups. It's very fluid, the movement from one Islamist organization to another. Nusra, though, was actually had relationships with, in one case, with Qatar. And some of these Islamist groups depended on foreign aid. ISIS is in a little different category. It's the richest terror group in history. It's got oil, it's got, banks, it has taxes, and it doesn't really depend on the aid from foreign countries. Nusra is in a different spot, and I think was more amenable to the pressure that was brought to bear on Theo's situation. It came through this group and through David and his efforts, and Ali Soufan, who made the connection with the head of intelligence in Qatar. And he actually sent one of his operatives into Syria who was threatened. They talked about killing him, but they actually did get the word out, and the transfer was effected through the Qatari agency.
Just to back up, and I should say, to be clear, David Bradley is my boss, the chairman of, and the owner of The Atlantic. Nancy, can you talk a little bit about what the relationship was like among the 5 families during this period when all your children were being held?
Well, early on, I went to somebody said, go to the Red Cross, the International Red Cross. I met with them, and the woman said to me, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there's another family from New England who has a son who's been taken captive. That's how I got touch with Diane Foley. And Theo and Jim Foley had a lot in common, both teachers, both committed to helping the disadvantaged, both writers. Both from northern New England, we knew they were going to be best friends when they got out. And I did not meet the other families or even know of their existence until David Bradley and the Atlantic brought all the families together, all 5 families together for a meeting in May of 2014. And we spent a whole day talking about our situation, and then a second day we were taken around Capitol Hill and to the FBI and to meet various congressmen and senators, all done through David Bradley and his team. And but I think Diane and I, because we had already known one another, we were the ones that were really remained close. But now, again, David Bradley has brought us all together, and you know, I think for both Theo and me, it's hard to recognize that he survived and the others did not. And it's been something for us to struggle with, but I think that the other families and their great generosity of heart recognize that something in their child survived in Theo, and they welcomed him with open arms.
Theo, I'd like to return to the question of what some of the lessons of this that can be extracted from this might be, and maybe what we should be doing as a country now. It's just astonishing to hear you say that effectively you were being used as an instrument to desensitize the kids and prepare them to be members of this extraordinary violent movement. What explains how your captors, what drew them, what draws them to this? What makes them...
It's all in the Quran. I don't think desensitization is not the right word. I think you can say that it's a heightened experience of... it's a spiritual experience for them to participate in these rituals that extract them from normal everyday life. When you are causing another human being to suffer, they would tell me, we were in the torture room, there'd be somebody hanging from the ceiling, screaming. He is screaming at the top of his lungs. They would tell me, this is our music. They feel that it brings them closer to God, to punish the enemies of God, of which I was one. By the way, all of you people, if you're Americans, are as well. Well, we are enemies of God because they believe that we, in the first place, as a country, are killing Muslims. Secondly, that Christianity is destined, and we're all Christians, by the way, destined to come into a end-of-time kind of conflict with Islam, and that Islam will eventually triumph over Christianity. Anyway, they're participating in this triumph at the moment, so they're approaching godliness. So, sorry, what was your question again?
No, but you've answered a much better question than the one I asked. But you say it's all in the Quran, and this is something of a debate we keep having in the U.S. about how to understand whether the origins of this version of Islam are authentic.
Right. I mean, this is not an issue that they debate, by the way, among themselves. 99.9% of their time they spend these are like merits. So you get merit points if you read the Quran. So they read the Quran a lot. To say to these people, you people are doing it all wrong, I mean, who are we to tell them that they have misinterpreted their religion? When you're living among these people, they're praying 5 times a day. They're reading the Quran. You're reading it I still think that my relations with these people, which are basically good, can be used to our advantage.
Well, then the next question is really to you and then to Larry. Based on everything you learned, what do you think we do about this movement? What's the best way
I think we should send them, like, aid. We should send them chocolates and blankets, and I think we have to be nicer to them. I really believe that their situation has to, we can keep killing these people, but more will come. You remember Stanley McChrystal's Insurgent Math. If you have 10 and you kill 2, you don't get 8, you get 20. This is truer in Syria. The bombs, I think, spread the hatred. The bombs that we're dropping now, that Putin is dropping now, they only spread the hatred and they create more. People come from, they're coming now from Chechnya, they're coming from Turkey, they're coming from the entire region. And this is an issue that Bashar al-Assad has to confront. That it's a vacuum now for Islamic extremists. To me, the solution is peacekeepers, and all of these conflicts end in the same way. There has to be a strong, powerful force that buys off some of the people and punishes the ones who refuse to be bought off.
And you think we should work with Assad then?
Yeah,
for that
that's what I think.
Larry?
The Assad regime is this massive flow of refugees. 1 out of 4 people in Lebanon right now is Syrian. There are 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. The whole Palestinian exodus in 1948 was 700,000, and now we've got 5 million Syrians away from the country. The 10 million, half the population of Syria is how can we stem that tide of refugees? I think creating a no-fly zone that would give a kind of sanctuary in northern Syria would probably be helpful. The other thing is our Sunni allies in the region are ambivalent about this because they want Assad gone, and so they're restrained in their attempt to help us contain ISIS. And I think eliminating that ambivalence would be very helpful. It happened with Jordan when one of their pilots was burned alive in a cage. But that may have led to Kayla's death. This is the Middle East. And, it's like a Rubik's Cube that doesn't have a solution. You can keep moving the pieces around.
Nancy, I think in closing, I'd just like to hear your answer to a simple question, which is how's Theo doing now?
I think it's self-evident. He's doing fine. I think he has endured horrific experience, as have the other families, but he was, I think it was helpful that he was a mature man. He was able to withdraw into himself, and he's come out wise and deeper and whole.
Thanks, Mom.
We'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.